So I guess my background started when I was working for BT when I was quite young, actually, in my very early 20s. I was selling international telecoms networks around the world to other telecoms operators and helping internet service providers actually become independent companies from leasing products and services from incumbent networks to actually creating their own companies and organisations and supplying them with the technologies and the infrastructure to be able to do that. Gave me a huge insight into how corporations and companies work and how the importance of relationships in that, and I guess probably a sense as well of how things can be created. And then from that I went on to have 3 kids, and in my part-time did business development and strategy and client relationship management for a range of different companies. How about you?
I come from kind of a different angle really, which is a combination of occupational psychology and organisational development, and particularly often in a European context, and working in a community education area with a particular kind of thing that's I've always come back to over and over the years, to do with accessibility and including people who are normally marginalised. And I think that's one of the things that's it's a bit like Sophie's kind of vision of a way that something could be built into a community platform. The thing that's attracted me to it has been more from that angle about community, I think.
What led us to it was a lot of conversations over about 10 years, over our respective kitchen tables, about, I guess, a lot of the issues in society, a lot of the problems caused by social media platforms, a lot of the inequalities in our economic systems, and
I think also there was we spent a lot of time looking at things like non-violent communication and exploring ways in which people can understand each other better and communicate better, and I guess from my point of view that was fed on naturally from a sort of interest in organisations, and you came on that with your angle, and then somehow I think those conversations grew into, particularly in your mind, into something a little bit more concrete and practical.
Yeah, it was kind of what can we do then? Because I've often been to a lot of economics conferences or other kind of workshops or conferences where there's a lot of talk about what the problems are. And then at the very last minute, if you're really lucky, somebody will have a slide where it says, well, the solution is in the grassroots and these movements that are really good at solving problems. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, but how? Like, we're talking about the people with the least resources somehow being the people that are going to solve all the problems, and how's that really going to work? So that's when I thought, well, okay, there are all these technologies that exist. We have social media platforms, but they're not facilitating us in problem solving. They have their own agenda, which is the attention economy. They want our attention so that they can generate data and advertising revenue. And I thought, well, what if we changed that? What if we created a social network where actually that wasn't the aim, but the aim was more to foster collaboration, creativity, and innovation? And what would that look like, and how could we make that work so that it actually does put power into the hands of those communities to create the solutions for themselves? And we thought a lot about, sharing economies, and how a real sharing economy would be people really sharing their stuff with each other, but without intermediaries taking and extracting wealth from that, but actually for everyone to be able to benefit from that themselves.
We also thought about how, in order to do that, you'd have to begin by doing something that society doesn't really do, which is thinking about how you would centre the people who are often completely left out, the people who are most marginalised, the people who are most vulnerable, and imagining what kind of a world, but also what kind of a digital space you would have if you started with that premise. And it would look very different from what's called the sharing economy now, which obviously is not really sharing so much as extractive. So we started to kind of experiment with that kind of thinking really and see where that led us.
Yeah, so the idea, I scribbled furiously in about 2 notebooks for quite a number of months. And I'd wake up with ideas and write them down. And then I realised that I was going to have to explain some of the kind of concept that had been developed with you. And we sat down with massive pieces of paper to think about what that would really look like and what we'd have to do first. And I think what we realised that the first thing was to look at simple things like, how would we work? How would an organisation like that work if it was going to not replicate the existing structures that are actually the cause of oppression? So if you're looking at creating a more equal world, then how can you work as an organisation to have ways of working, ways of valuing people's contribution that are not using the same systems? So we looked at what community would look like. We looked at what the ways of working would be, how you would kind of acknowledge different forms of labour, whether there could be systems that would allow people to, that would acknowledge forms of labour that are not currently acknowledged or valued in society, like emotional labour and domestic labour and caring labour.
I think the big jump was there was something which I think you did on your own during that process, which was making that jump to actually envisaging an actual platform and how it would work and the kind of things it could do. And from my experience, I was more of a recipient of that because I would say, well, there's this problem, and you would say, you could develop an app for that. And I had that cropped up over and over again, and I realised that you had got something where you'd started to join together all the bits into a vision of something that I hadn't really got at that point. So maybe you could...
Yeah, so the Commons Platform as it stands at the moment is a collective of people building this. So there are about 300 or so people, maybe 350 including people that are not in the Facebook group who are sort of loosely connected with it. But with them come a lot of organisations that are looking to maybe use the Commons Platform as a platform for independent media or for their circular economies. So that's what it is at the moment, but what it could be, or what it intends to be, is a way of joining up all of the things that people are already doing. So the alternative economies that already exist around the world, and the things like people who've got spaces that they've managed to create for communities, for example. There are lots of those around, but there are also lots of grassroots groups that don't have spaces. And so the first stage really is like connecting up all of the things that already exist. So not having to create something completely new and impose it, but to actually establish what's already existing, what kind of support people need from each other, and connecting that up within our network and the sort of wider network. And then from that, and actually also looking at how that community operates together, because again, it's in a different way from what we expect of a startup. It's not a startup model, but it's a model that allows for crowdsourcing. So it allows people to bring their skills, bring what's already in existence, and build it together. And then any apps that people are developing, then if they're interoperable, means that, as you've pointed out a lot, each time something is developed, it's not hived away. People aren't saying, well, this is my thing and I've developed it and no one can share it. It's actually the opposite of that. So once something is developed in one place, which might be a tool sharing scheme, that can then be used across the wider network. So then everyone can share their tools with each other.
I think a good example of a way of maybe describing that so that it can be understood more easily, because part of the problem in describing this, I think, is that it's quite a diffuse idea. And how people understand it often depends on the context with which they're coming to it. So, as an example, we were talking to somebody about who's trying to set up a kind of cooperative taxi scheme that's a bit like a kind of local Uber, using an app that they're trying to develop, which the drivers would own in common, and which they would then benefit from sharing that out amongst them. So what we were thinking was in the context of the platform that we're developing is, if you developed an app for that purpose, with the mapping, the billing, the booking combination that it's got in it, you would only have to do it once, because it would then be owned in common by everybody who's a member of the platform, and it would then be open source and could be rolled out to anybody else who wanted to, in whatever city, wanted to form a taxi cooperative. So somebody coming from that particular angle would see immediately what the purpose of that is. But there are so many things that thinking could lend itself to that it's hard to describe it in one overall sense.
So if, for example, there was a partnership with FreeCycle, and if there was a tool sharing network in communities, if there was something where for example, there are a lot of retired people who may be out of work but still have a really important skill, like a cobbler or someone who does gardening or mends tools or something. If all of those, if the network is aware of all of those skills and all of that capacity, because people can easily state what their skills are and when they're free, you could have something, for example, if my shoe breaks and I need it fixed by the evening, I could just type in shoe. And it would tell me who in the area can fix it for me. It could tell me who might be passing at that time of day, because they do the school run every day. So they could be the person that collects my shoe and delivers it back at the end of the day. Or it might be that that can't happen, but that there's somebody who's selling a pair of shoes nearby, or there's an ethical shoe manufacturer in my area. So rather than me having to open every single window to find out how much it is to get a new pair on Amazon, or whether there's a pair on eBay, or whether there is someone in my area that can mend shoes, if all of that information is held within the Commons platform, then all I really have to do is type what my problem is, and I can find the solution to that within the local economy, and also know that the solutions I'm using are things that benefit people in my neighbourhood, where the kind of money generated from that is kept within the local economy, and where, for example, I can set my preferences that if I were to buy new shoes, I would be able to buy the most ethical shoes, because the wiki of people on the platform would already be, working on generating a list of, which companies are the most ethical. And then, of course, the implications of that are that if everyone as a collective, the bigger it is and the more it scales, if everyone as a collective is aiming to buy the most ethical products, then that starts to change everything, because then what is considered profitable changes. So profitable is no longer just what is the most able to cut costs the most, which has the most cost to the environment, because that cost, somebody is always paying that cost somewhere. So whether it's in the polluting of a river, or people who are not being paid properly, or factories that are unsafe to work in, profitable actually then gets redefined as what is the thing that people are going to want to buy if it's easy enough for them to access the information about what they can buy that's in line with their values. And the larger we are as a collective, so the bigger the network is, the more of us doing that, the less it is then something that is just only available to those privileged, because the more people are buying those products that are ethical, the better the economies of scale, and then the price comes down for everyone.
As I said, with the starting point of that, was thinking, how would it look if you tried to centre and make it safe for the most vulnerable and the most marginalised? But it's not just about making it safe, it's about making it the kind of space where people who are normally left out feel that they could have a stake and feel that they could be heard properly, so that their voices could actually carry some weight in a way that often they don't in the way society is structured at the moment. One of the things that we're doing to try and get that to happen is to include as many people as possible from as many different backgrounds as possible. We've got to the point where we're a little bit hesitant to use words like inclusion, but we haven't come up with anything better. The problem with inclusion, of course, is it suggests that somebody is doing the including, and so you already have a kind of slightly built-in problem with that, but we're limited by, to some extent at the moment, by the way the language happens to be. But we're trying to involve as many people as possible, and to actually listen to what they've got to say, and to create and build, right from the beginning, collaboratively, a value structure that incorporates all of that thinking, and that kind of covers. It covers quite a spread of things, actually. It starts with a kind of basic awareness of human communication and things to do with like boundaries and consent. Digital companies in general have got a terrible history when it comes to just the basic thinking about consent, starting with those gigantic agreements where you sign away all your rights when you haven't read anything, and they're completely irreversible.
And they would take 8 hours to read or something, when they fall to 8 hours if you actually read them.
So we're sort of trying to undo the thinking completely on that, and start from the basis of having an actual consent culture, and actually training people in what that means, so that even the way we work together collaboratively has that built into it, a kind of consent culture. Beyond that, we're also looking at ways of actively trying to include as many people from as many backgrounds as possible, and talking to them about what that would involve. It's quite interesting, actually. When we first started running workshops, because we've started this, the way we've evolved this has been through a series of workshops covering different areas and inviting people to them. And at the beginning, we were very active in really trying to include as many people from as many different kind of backgrounds as we could, and we did pretty well with it, actually. We're also looking at accessibility issues just on a basic level, from things to do with disability, across a range of issues, and also the way that all of this will eventually feed into the tech, because an awful lot of tech is developed by young white men and has a certain kind of thinking built into it, or assumptions built into it, and we realise that we actually need to get a lot of the culture sorted out before we can even properly embark on that, and also involve our developers in the culture that we're trying to develop, so that everybody's on the same page and we understand now, and we can work together to try and find new solutions to those problems.
Yeah, so again, going back to that model of looking at how communities could be operating where they're sharing spare capacity with each other, whatever spare capacity that might be, whether that's their time or their skills or their stuff. Distributed ledger technology lends itself really well to being able to create trust between people who don't necessarily know each other, and also where those payments can be made to each other in ways that don't need intermediaries. So again, keeping more of that money in local economies. It also means that people who don't have access to banking can still be part of that economy. And I guess as well, like one of the things that really excite us is the idea that you can acknowledge other forms of value. So not just the kind of, I'm going to pay you to do this job for me, but like what other forms of value are there, like emotional labour and caring labour? And is there a way that blockchain or another distributed ledger technology could be used to acknowledge the value that's been created by those actions, and whether that means that somebody gets some sort of dividend from it, or whether it means that everyone can see how much value has been created within the network, which might be really inspiring for people to think, wow, as a collective, we have generated this much value, which means that we are this much more kind of equipped as a society to be able to help each other, or whatever that might be. And of course, then, you know, the idea of a cryptocurrency kind of flows naturally from that. Again, so that people who don't have access to banking can be involved in economies. And then what feels really important to me as well is, if that's the case, that could create an inequality in that some people may not have access to this platform. So a big part of our kind of longer term planning is to make sure that more people have access to the internet. Otherwise, it's not really achieving its aim if it's not allowing, you know, if it creates an inequality with people who are either on the platform or people who can't access it. So part of that is also working with groups to help build mesh networks. So supposing only one person in a town has got access to the internet, it's helping communities actually turn that into a local mesh where everyone can be part of it. And then blockchain is useful there because you can pay micropayments to the person who's got the internet access, and then you can have, and then it gives everyone access to the other benefits of the platform.
Yeah, and we've already got an alliance with a group who are doing exactly that, and the US mostly, because strangely the US, despite being, you know, the highly developed country, has got huge areas where I guess AT&T didn't think it was worth their while in poor areas to you know, put the cabling in. So we've got already formed a really interesting alliance with a group who are building mesh networks in some poorer American urban areas.
And they're already using blockchain, aren't they?
They
for
are
the
using
micropayments.
blockchain, yeah. For that very, very reason, yeah.
It ranges. I mean, there's a huge range actually.
Yeah, that's
so
one, obviously the mesh networks.
Yeah. Another one is about independent media. So we see this as being quite naturally becoming a platform for content, but curated content. So rather than, again, just like scroll until you fall over kind of, it's more like, how can you be connected up with the things that are meaningful to you? So when you join the platform, you might sign in and say, these are my interests, and then you can have content that's curated that helps you find out about the world in the way that you want to engage with it. And that's quite interesting from the point of view of independent media, because there are lots and lots of independent journalists around the world who don't really have a platform, because if the things they're writing about are not what the main news platforms are looking for, and if they're not what current social media platforms are looking for, because they thrive on outrage, for the kind of journalism that's not currently really catered for either by existing journalist platforms or by social media platforms, it's a really good kind of opportunity for them and an opportunity for us, because they could migrate their content onto this platform, but with it comes their readership.
Well, there are other kind of things which are very different. I mean, there's an organisation called Respace, which is one of several organisations in London that take over disused buildings. Usually, they form an agreement with the developer if a building's empty for a few years while it's awaiting some kind of development, they negotiate the space so that they can use it for community projects, which covers a range of things. Sometimes it's for homeless people, sometimes it's to run education programs or whatever, and they actually bring a lot of equipment and furniture in and convert the space for a while, and they operate in a kind of circular economy way where they're getting stuff that gets reused from all other sites, and they bring it in. They have volunteers from all over the place, and they're constantly looking for buildings, and we talk to them because they would find a use for a platform like this in order to simplify and record all of that process so that they would have information about where buildings were, about who was available to help take them over and rework them, about where they could get supplies and furniture and so on from, and that kind of thing. And the beauty of that is that once it's one of those things that once you've developed that and you've done that once, it can be reused as a kind of template over and over again, and it can also be used for people who are trying to set up a kind of respace type project in other cities anywhere where that may be a new concept. So that was another example. There's also a lot of grassroots organisations of a kind of activist nature who I think are very interested in having this kind of platform where you're not having to surrender your data, which is one of the huge things about most commercial networks or platforms is that your data is very prominent in the news at the moment. It gets harvested and used for whatever purposes. Having a platform like this where your data would remain in commons ownership and nothing would happen to it, it would never be sold for any purpose, is quite attractive to a lot of groups who are based elsewhere at the moment.
And it means it's safer as well for environmental activists who are at huge risk, for example, from loggers or governments in protecting their land. So we've been speaking to people about ways in which the platform could generate real-time data and open research and open data that can actually help protect their land. So they could operate with privacy and security in uploading data that shows how their forest or their grasslands are being changed and what's happening to it, so that then other scientists around the world or other environmental activists can see how that data is being changed in real time and actually then start collaborating to protect those areas. And then in terms of other sort of collaborations, we've got a good relationship with Mozilla, which is great. And that came from a conversation where I had a 5-minute chat with the CEO, Mark Thurman, and that was at MozFest just after a conversation about the open source movement and what that movement might need in order to be something that actually gathers momentum. And they've acknowledged that actually it's very hard to bring this concept of open source into a sort of wider context that other people can engage with and understand. But when I told them about the Commons platform and that actually it's something it's a social network as well, so it brings people who are interested in seeing, in the world and interested in the concept of a healthy internet, but without necessarily being techie. So but it's using open source software and it's sharing that software among the network. That's actually really interesting to them because it's actually bringing people together with the same aims and creating more of a kind of movement, more of a sense of
collaboration.
Collaboration and coming together with those shared values. And also, I think they're very interested at the moment in the concept of the Internet of Things. And I guess the way we see this is that it's not just things, it's like a whole internet of kindness, an internet of people, an internet of sharing, which then, for me, what gets really exciting is beyond the idea of the smart city, which for me is a bit of a dystopian horror movie, where data and wealth is extracted out of every single thing we do, that we share with each other, or that we, every car that we get into or everywhere we go. It's more like, well, if we were able to collaborate all together to do that, then we could have something more like a smart planet where we could be doing all of the things that all of us need in ways that support everyone and that are collaborative. So rather than looking at it purely from the point of view of funding, as in money, we're looking at it from the point of view of crowdsourcing and recognising that within the wider network there are people with a huge amount of skills, from anything from tech to economics. There are quite a few, there's a number of specialists in all kinds of fields within the network that's growing at the moment. Platform cooperatives, alternative economics, software
tech
development,
people, lots of software developers,
and then the social side of it as well. So experts on consent culture, people who've written books about exactly the kind of stuff we're talking about.
That's been amazing. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about doing something which is not based along a traditional business or capitalist model is we found that rather than everybody kind of approaching the situation a bit like this, where everybody's kind of gradually revealing little bits of information. People have been incredibly open and incredibly generous, offer to share stuff collaboratively very quickly. Trust is built up very quickly. It's made me realise in a way how much the normal standard capitalist model has kind of atomised and fragmented the kind of what would be the human experience without the means of fiat exchange that we've all got used to having to live by, because freed from that, it's quite liberating, and it's quite interesting to see how willing people are to really share stuff and dig down and really put their backs into things that you would think you might be asking too much, and it's amazing how people have stepped forward. I think it's been very encouraging.
Office space, places to host workshops, which means that people can then come for free. No one's having to pay to do any of this. We're not having to pay to host it either. So it means that more people are able to come. So the people who might normally not be able to participate in something like this because of money are able to. And yes, like you said, developers from Mozilla, other developers within the network as well.
Web hosting potentially as well is a possibility. So
so people come and they offer the things that we might need, and we're like, wow, yeah, that's brilliant.
I think it's entirely possible that at some point further down the road, and we have got a roadmap that takes us through to the end of the year, then we're going to have to start looking seriously at where financing of some sort might be needed. But I've got a very open mind about what that might look like. That's also tied up with us looking at alternative economic models, which will be part of the whole discussion about cryptocurrencies, blockchain. Potentially initial coin offering. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of looking at that. And some of the people that we've formed alliances with are in things like the New Economic Foundation, and people who are looking at a range of ways of tackling these issues. And it's quite exciting to have that kind of level of thinking involved in where we might be able to create more of a kind of cooperative circular economy in the end.